Hi, I'm Murphy, and this is my channel, Murphy's Every Whim, where I talk about books. Because I love to talk about books. I love to open my mouth and information about books just flows out. I just had some family here visiting for a day, and I would say that 15-20% of the conversation involved books. So I'm here to talk about my August reads, and I had quite a few reads, but some of them were very short. And this is also a brief garbaugust report. Brief because I got sidetracked into other things going on in August, and so I didn't read nearly as much as I thought I had when I made my garbaugust TBR post, but that's okay. I'm going to talk about LibraryThing just a little bit, and short stories. And I've already posted about that, so there's more information about short stories in another video. But it is just barely noon today. It's earlier in the day than usual. That way the sun is not coming in this direction. My partner, HWC, decided that since we were having company that we should rearrange the great room, and so I'm trying this location out to see how this works. I can always go back to the other location if the light's better there, because here I've got sort of the light on one side, shadow on the other. All right, so in August, I did participate in garbaugust as much as it turns out, and I read 3 books for garbaugust. One was The Delta Factor by Mickey Spillane, and I really enjoyed this book. It's not a, Mike Hammer book. It's about a character named Morgan, and that's his whole name. No first name, no middle name. And he had been in the military and trained by the military for espionage and covert actions. What we would call special ops now, but I don't think they called it that in World War II. And he then goes on to a life of crime, and he supposedly has stolen a large quantity of money from the government. And so the government comes in and coerces him into doing some jobs for them that are similar to the ones that he did when he was working in World War II. And he ends up going to an island nation with a Spanish heritage that's not Cuba. So he goes to Cuba, not Cuba, and has to deal with the local authorities there. He's trying to get somebody out of prison that they want to rescue, and they send a handler with him, and that's a woman. And because this was written in 1967, the handler, who's a woman, and he get married legally in Georgia before they go to Cuba, not Cuba. And so it ends up, and then there's a hurricane. So it ends up having a lot of Key Largo vibes. It has a lot of Mr. and Mrs. Smith vibes where, they're married, but they supposedly hate each other or don't hate each other, not quite sure. A lot of cheesy stuff, a lot of casino, a lot of nightclub kind of action. So it was really, really very fun. I like the action in it. I can see how this book might have been the impetus for many things that we see nowadays. another book for garbaugust was The Case of the Velvet Claws, and that's C-L-A-W-S. And I looked up velvet claws, C-L-A-U-S-E, to see if there was such a thing, like maybe a velvet clause was something that would be put into a will or something. So this is the first Perry Mason book, and I noticed that for later editions that I have in my collection, it says the courtroom dramas, but there is no courtroom drama here. The story is a woman is in trouble, her husband ends up dead, she accuses Perry Mason of doing that because she doesn't want her paramour, who's a politician, to be involved in it at all. Anyway, it's pretty much your basic Perry Mason. I love reading. This was written in 1935, I believe, and I love reading the language used, the technology that was used, how Perry has to move around from pharmacy, and not pharmacy, he calls them drugstores to drugstores, which were the diners at the time also, but they were the place where you could use a telephone. So he's always having to find a telephone to use. So I like that. I remember those days, being out, maybe going out to the bar and having to use a telephone and having to find a telephone and maybe having to use one outside that wasn't in a booth where it was too loud. So those days are gone. A fun little book. Perry and Della do kiss in this book. And then the next one was actually an audio book that wasn't a book. So Dashiell Hammett was both a pulp author and an author that legitimized the hardcore detective, and with books like The Maltese Falcon, which became very popular in its own right, along with his other books. He wrote The Thin Man, and MGM had made a movie from The Thin Man. I hope I got the studio right. But they made a movie from The Thin Man, and they wanted to have a sequel, and so they hired Dashiell Hammett to write a novella that then could be turned into a screenplay by the Hacketts, who were the screenwriters for at least the first 3 of the 6 movies in the series. And so this book, The Return of the Thin Man, and there was never a movie named The Return of the Thin Man, it had the novella and another novella, which I'm not quite sure how that one was written, not under contract per se, but 2 novellas written by Dashiell Hammett for the next 2 movies in the series, which were Another Thin Man and The Thin Man Returns, or I can't remember the name of the other movie. And so this has those novellas, but then also some articles about how these were written, how the Hacketts worked, how turning, since The Thin Man was a pre-code movie, and the next movies were under the movie code, so the Hacketts had to figure out a way to incorporate the things that were popular in the Thin Man movie and book that probably wouldn't pass the code in the time that they wrote these. And so it was an interesting to read those novellas, to read the articles about those, and then I went ahead and watched the first 3 movies in the Thin Men series after I had read them. And so that was all a very nice package, but definitely The Thin Men was originally written as trashy literature just to make money, and it ended up making more money than Dashiell Hammett thought that it would make. But so those were the only garbaugust reads that I had. And because I got wrapped up in another project, so to speak, And that is that I got back onto LibraryThing after not being on it for a while. I know that people use Goodreads to catalog their books. Some people just use spreadsheets. I use a spreadsheet. And some people, there's another non-Goodreads, not Goodreads program out there that some people use. But I've been a member of LibraryThing for 10 years, and that's where I tended to catalog books. I don't depend on it to have everything in there. But one of the things that LibraryThing has is an early reviewers program. And so I do sign up for early reviewers, and I started doing that again. But when I did, I discovered that I had some reviews that were long overdue. And so I decided to catch up on all of my reviews, no matter how belated they would be. And some were pretty belated. One of those books I had to write a review for was Endman by Alex Austen. And in Endman, it has a really interesting premise. It's a near future book, and the main character, Raphael, is psychologically limited to a square mile that he can be in LA. And it's a psychological barrier. There's actually a name for this, the fear of crossing streets, but in his case it's the fear of crossing main streets with, multiple lanes of traffic. And it's not just I'm scared to cross, but actually a barrier. And it ends up that each of these 4 main roads in LA that he's bounded by have some sort of different psychological issue when he tries to cross them. One of them puts up a wall of fire in his brain, one of them a wall of ice, one of them spreads apart and becomes a chasm, and the other is a huge wind that would just literally, at least in his mind, blow him off his feet. So that's one piece of the premise that's really interesting, that he's geographically limited to this square mile. And then the other interesting premise is that the company he works for, when someone dies, they take their digital content from their entire life and they archive it. And then if somebody, I think they have to get permission from the family to do that. I'm not quite sure what all the details were, or maybe I just don't want to share them with you. But so they get their digital content, their digital life, and they archive it, and then they have plans for that. And so it's an interesting premise. There are people who have faked their death, gone off grid, but so they're still alive, but it appears online that they've died. And his job, Raphael's job, is to hunt these people up to see if they've really died or not. And there's a reason why he's having to do that as well. That's interesting and unfolds. Anyway, so it's an interesting book that I gave a good review for. And then The Mask by Taylor Stevens. And this is the 5th or 6th book in the Vanessa Michael Munroe series. And I had not read any other books in the series. So one of the things I was looking for, as with any time I dive into the middle of a series, is did I need to read the previous books? And I just want to say up front that I felt like I got enough information about the past that this book could stand alone to a certain extent. Yes, it made me curious about what happened before, and there were things about the character who went by Michael most of the time that I needed to know about him. In the book, they always used female pronouns, she, her, but the character, Vanessa Michael Munroe, sometimes went by Vanessa and dressed as a woman, sometimes presented as a man, and mostly for the purpose of being able to do her job. So anyway, I don't want to say too much. It's set in Japan, which was interesting. So there were a lot of Japanese customs, and Michael had to navigate how you deal with people. And she seemed to be really good at being able to read what was actually being said behind the words that people said. Of course, whether someone who just is entering this culture could get that nuance or not. She has a talent for languages, so she picked up in just a few months enough Japanese to get by very well, at least in spoken language, but she couldn't read Japanese. And she had other superpowers. So did I mind that she had superpowers? Not really. The book is about corporate espionage, and so I'll just leave it at that. And but about the writing, one of the things that I find about a lot of books is that they have trouble getting started. It's like the author has a really good idea of what the body will be, but there has to be this start, and sometimes starts are clumsy. And I'm never sure if when I am reading a book, and I read this on an e-reader, when I'm reading a book at the beginning, if I'm stumbling over the language because it's rougher than once we get to the body, or if I just get used to the language way that goes when I get to the body. But I think in this case that the first few chapters of the book were really kind of clumsy, convoluted, overly ornate. But once I got into the body, I really had to read this book. And so again, I gave this a good review with a couple of caveats. The superhero sort of abilities of Michael and some inconsistencies with language. And if you know anything about Taylor Stevens, the author, I don't want to talk about that, but people get hung up with her history, and I think that's neither here nor there. It's interesting, but if you're interested, go check it out. Another set of books that I read as part of a project were books that I had on Audible that were only partially finished. And so I finished those. And I've talked about these books already in another video, so I'm just going to name them. The Extraordinary Life of Sam Hell. The Majestic 311 is another book that I had started and I decided to finish. This is by, by the way, The Extraordinary Life of Sam Hell is by Robert Dugoni, and Majestic 311 is by Keith C. Blackmore. Another one I finished that I'd partially read was Slan by A.E. Van Vogt, and this is a classic science fiction, and I did talk about this in another video. And then the last one is Body of Proof by Darrell Brown, and this is a true crime, podcasty sounding story that, to be honest, I think I slept through and didn't feel like I missed much. All right, and then the last set of things that I read were short stories. And I've talked about some of these a lot, but I did read a few more that weren't on that list. One was a book by John Taylor, and this was Sherlock Holmes, The Rediscovered Railway Mysteries and Other Stories. And there were 4 stories in this. And, of course, they starred Sherlock Holmes, John Watson, Is his first name John? I just now realized I'm not sure. Anyway, and they live together at, on Baker Street. And these stories are interesting, but they don't quite have that Sherlock Holmes flavor to them. And so I read a Sherlock Holmes, an Arthur Conan Doyle Sherlock Holmes, and that was The Adventure of the Cardboard Box. And I read that after the railroad stories, and it reminded me how Sherlock Holmes stories were and how the ones in the book by John Taylor were good, but didn't have quite that flavor to them. So those are the August reads. I think it was 10 books and then 4 or 5, 6 short stories. And I enjoyed that. I'm already working on September, and I found Shorty September. I find this a really interesting reading project. I printed off the little zine that you can have and have started working on that. But so I'm working on Shorty September, and I'm working on finishing up the reviews that I have to finish to make myself feel better for LibraryThing, so that the 2 books that I got this month for LibraryThing early readers program, early reviewers program, I can write those reviews in a timely fashion and feel better about asking for 2 more books next time. All right, so those are the August reads. Hopefully I said August all the time and not June or July or September when I meant to say August. And I don't have anything else to say. So, bye. Take care. Let's talk about August reads. Did I say August reads earlier? I'll have to check.